Before I begin this video, let me just make the following statement as a fact. True Christianity is a religion of peace. It condemns the use of violence, which is not permitted in any shape or form. Later in this video, I will provide clear scriptural evidence to back up all of my claims, so please bear with me. The Bible is basically a rule book from God to be used as a guide by His people who are living in the world. The Bible is made up of two sections: the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is also known as the Old Covenant that God made with the ancient Jews who were living in the wilderness. It was originally written as a guide for these Jews alive around the time of Moses. The New Testament is also known as the New Covenant that God made with the born-again Jews and Gentiles who today are identified as Christians. Its teachings still apply to Christians today, right up until the time of Christ's second coming, at the end of the age we are currently living in. The Old Testament contains a lot of violent verses. This is partly due to the wars that the ancient Jews were constantly involved in. The New Testament contains a lot of peaceful verses. This is because it's based on the passive teachings and life of Jesus Christ. However, I do hear some people say Christianity is not a religion of peace, and what about the violence used by the Catholic Crusaders or the Spanish Inquisition or the Ku Klux Klan or even by the modern day Christian soldiers who invaded Iraq? Are not all of these examples of violence in Christianity? The answer to that question is a resounding no, and here is why. When Jesus Christ came with his message approximately 2,000 years ago, he gave strict orders to all of his Christian followers to observe the rule of peace. Violence is absolutely not permitted. Basically, Jesus encouraged a continuation of the Mosaic laws, also known as the laws of Moses. However, Jesus made a number of alterations to the Mosaic laws, essentially creating a Mark II version. One of the alterations was to discontinue the use of violent punishment laws, along with any form of violence whatsoever. However, over the course of time, and even to this day, there are many Christians who believe that some form of physical self-defense is permitted. But this is strongly opposed by strictly pacifist Christians. Basically, it is a highly debated subject matter. Okay, so to give you a rough idea of some of the violent Jewish laws in the Old Testament, which no longer apply today, I will give you the following examples. Exodus chapter 21, verse 24. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 11 to 12. If two men are fighting, and the wife of one steps in to rescue her husband from the one striking him, and she reaches out her hand and grabs his genitals, you are to cut off her hand. You must show her no pity. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 1 to 3. If two men take a dispute to court, and the judge declares that one is right and the other is wrong, if the person in the wrong is sentenced to be flogged, the judge must order him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with the number of lashes appropriate to the crime, but never give him more than 40 lashes. Any more than 40 lashes would publicly humiliate your neighbour. One of the main reasons why God gave a variety of violent laws to the ancient Jews living in the wilderness is mainly because they were stubborn and rebellious, and they required a great deal of discipline. It's important for me to point out that the ancient Jews were a very primitive people who were exposed to horrendous torture and violence when they were previously kept in slavery by the Egyptians in the land of Egypt. Think of it this way: if a group of people like the ancient Jews had spent most of their lives in rough slavery, being constantly beaten into submission by their captors, then it is logical to assume that they only understood the rule of law being enforced through the use of violence. So now we can begin to see why God had to prescribe the Jews with a variety of violent laws after they were released from Egypt. Basically, after God rescued the Jews out of the land of Egypt, he had to immediately provide them with a brand new law system to be able to take full control of them. This new law system had to be something with which they were already familiar with and accustomed to, which they experienced in Egypt. This is why we see the Old Testament containing a large amount of violent Jewish laws. It was simply so that God could teach the Jews discipline. Coming up in part 2, I will provide the scriptural evidence to back up my claims.